Growing up in the early 2000s was a weird time. We were between the tech waves, so we had things like PlayStation 2s to keep us occupied, but still found enjoyment in actually going outside with our friends. Or the obnoxious neighbor kids our parents forced us to be nice to. Lord knows we all had one. And at the end of an event-filled weekend, nothing beat being able to wind down with your favorite Disney or Nickelodeon cartoons. These sitcom-esque episodics being the perfect means to shut down and enjoy senseless entertainment like SpongeBob and the Fairly Odd Parents. But everything changed in February 2005, when the first episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender dropped. Avatar was a completely different spectacle than what we were used to. There were stakes, tragedy, and actual evil represented, and all in a way a kid could follow. Of all its praise, Avatar's ability to take mature topics and present them in a kid-friendly manner was a major success, something very few have replicated since. Like most live-action adaptations, I was skeptical when Netflix announced they were taking a chance on the story of Aang and the gang, and the last live-action adaptation certainly didn't help. However, with news the original creators were involved, and the recent success of the One Piece adaptation, I found myself feeling excited. Well, that was up until the showrunner decided to open his mouth. Needless to say, I still wanted to give Avatar its chance, to see if it could surprise me the same way its original did 20 years ago. And it sure was chock full of surprises. The thing is, I'm not so convinced this show is bad. At least not as bad as everyone on Twitter claims. But while Netflix's Avatar works as its own separate take on the world and story, at least to some degree, there are some very noticeable flaws. Its attempt to adapt the heart and emotions of the original falls flat, making it a failure in terms of adaptation. So today, we're turning our adaptation series on its head, and talking about how an interesting experience can still be made from a poor adaptation. Right off the bat, it's clear that this will not be the Avatar we grew up with, a much darker tone being wielded in the early infiltration of the Fire Nation. Now, I talked at length about how I like when adaptations make changes to the story and characters back when I made my One Piece adaptation video in September. I'm on the boat of people that don't like one-for-one remakes, and see them as unnecessary. But these adaptations need to keep the original's heart alive, and this version of Avatar feels like it goes a long way to stomp out its former's image, the lighthearted nature of old Avatar muddied for this grittier reality. A great deal of the first episode comes off as super depressing and dour, dampening the light once shown through Aang's return. Funnily enough, Avatar and One Piece operate on very similar wavelengths. When looking from a top-down vantage, these are depressing worlds ruled by tyrannical governments and systems meant to harm the innocent. But with Aang and Luffy serving as our lens, these horrible corrupt worlds are molded into something fun and whimsical. Growing up as a kid, I'd love to have been in the world of Avatar, as I'd seen it all through Aang's antics, his actions shining light on the good that persists through all the bad. But this version offers a dystopia, the likes of which even the characters on the show would rather escape. And this all starts with Aang. Aang is the heart of The Last Airbender, his childlike and carefree attitude being what set him apart from all the other characters on the animated show. Right from his introduction, I realized this was not the Aang we grew up with. His first lines revolving around him skipping classes and being bored of training with his fellow airbenders. While Twitter of course did what it does best and missed the point, "Oh no, Aang's flying without his glider," the real problem arises with the choice to have Aang avoid his fellow classmates. He'd always been a skilled airbender, but this led to him goofing off before the other kids. Above all else, Aang is a showboat. He loves the attention of other kids and would see this as an opportunity to build an audience. But this Aang doesn't care. He'd much rather pal around with Gyatso. And while he talks of having had a lot of friends back then, these opening scenes leave the impression of Aang being a recluse, with his only friend being the elderly monk, which was never the case. Pulling Aang from the other kids creates a massive disservice to what he's meant to represent: childhood freedom. Almost every place the gang went in the early series, a major role Aang played was reminding the young freedom fighters that they were still kids, and help them to get back in touch with their youth. This was something that would even seep into Katara and Sokka, the trio letting loose multiple times through the series and still being able to get serious when the fight came to them. We're given brief glimpses into the old Aang, but his nature is flipped. He spends most of this season racked with guilt, depressed over the past and paranoid for what the future holds in store. Where animated Aang's childish antics led to distractions from his duties as Avatar, Netflix Aang uses these small distractions to keep himself from being overwhelmed. And this is what makes matters so messy. On its own, this isn't a bad way to represent a character like Aang, and he fits with the darker tone of this take. But this isn't our Aang, and fans hoping to see the character we know and love will feel slighted by these core alterations. To better break down this separation of character, we first need to understand what Aang represents, and that is hope. The original Aang stands as a literal embodiment of hope. Yes, he had a number of times where things weighed on him and felt the overwhelming emotions that plague his live-action counterpart, but more often than not, Aang was the perfect personification of joy and hope, spreading it across each and every settlement he and the gang would visit. This new version reduces Aang to a mere messenger. He's no longer embodying the qualities of hope, instead inspiring it through his successes, not earning their face until after uniting with Kyoshi to fend off Zhao, or overcoming the Face Stealer. It's more realistic and understandable, but Aang's only restoring hope now through his actions and as the all-powerful Avatar, and not through his own character. All this strips back a major layer to the character of Aang, and destroys an important lesson for its viewers. Upon arriving to any location, Aang would be met with unrealistic expectations, leadership only caring for the arrival of the Avatar. Yet, by the time the gang left, it was Aang that earned their faith, not his status. Too many of the live-action's accomplishments are attributed to Aang's role as the Avatar, as a large majority of his screen time beyond battle sees him moping about the after effects of his 100-year disappearance. While Aang doesn't leave much of an impression with the settlements he's helped, he does inspire major reactions from our main cast, planting seeds that'll grow to sprout much better versions of Sokka, Katara, and even Zuko. The time Aang spends with Teo and Amashu proves that he still has a way with his allies, particularly when it comes to smaller, more intimate conversations. Aang's accomplishments are much smaller this time around, directed onto a single individual or just a small group. Though that's not to say that these small ripples are incapable of generating a much larger impact. Now, I don't want to paint the wrong image of Aang here. Despite his changes, he's still a likable character, and one I found myself rooting for throughout. But for those unable to see past the alterations from our original Aang, that feeling may not carry over. And the added inconsistencies where the supporting cast speaks about Aang as if he was still the original version doesn't help. Bumi particularly makes a lot of claims of Aang being distracted and not taking his duties seriously. Yet, this version of Aang is pretty mission-driven right from the start. And mind you, Aang feels more guilt for his disappearance here than was ever portrayed in the animated show. Something that feels out of place when his disappearance occurs more as an accident. He only intended to clear his head and come back. Netflix's Aang never planning on fleeing from his duties in the first place, making a lot of these accusations feel out of place for this iteration of the character. Every major player underwent change, molded to better fit the darker tone and depressing world before us. But these changes never made Aang, Katara, Sokka, or Zuko feel completely unrecognizable. Their core ideals remained intact. Zuko wanted to restore honor and return home. Katara was set to aid Aang and better her waterbending, and Sokka wanted to protect his sister and become a warrior worthy of his tribe. That doesn't mean there weren't changes that went too far, particularly when it came to Aang, but none of these changes detracted from who they were meant to be. It just separated them from their more animated counterparts. Of them all, Sokka was probably the closest we got to the original character. Though toned down, there were various moments where I could pick up the original's heart. Unfortunately, not all received this benefit, and there are 3 major players I wanted to talk about. The Netflix series definitely took its liberties, and while some changes made for compelling alternate takes, there were others that completely missed the mark, making an ass of the characters we were meant to love. Something that harmed Iroh, Suki, and especially Bumi. We'll start with Iroh as he was the least offensive of the trio, finding his footing somewhere between the 3rd and 4th episodes. Though considering there's only 8 in the season, we're still talking about 40 to 50% of the way in. My biggest issue with Iroh was delivery. Early episodes painting him as a more condescending figure on Zuko's voyage. He's no longer carefree and guiding, he's belittling.
Where do you think we'll find the Avatar?
Yes.
Because of the light. All I'm saying is, it's hard to see you get your hopes up every time you see a sign.
I couldn't exactly tell if this was a deliberate choice or just a line delivery mishap that the director never bothered to correct, but I just didn't see Iroh as a man on Zuko's side, at least not until after the episode 4 rescue. My honest assumption is that this was simply an issue with Lee's early delivery of his lines, and while I'm glad he found his footing and delivered a pretty great Iroh for the rest of the show, I am a little disappointed no one thought to work with him to try and fix some of these early interactions. If we're escalating, that puts Suki second on our list. Though certainly worse than Iroh, she thankfully never touched the same levels as poor Boomy. Unfortunately, a lot of Suki's shortcomings come in thanks to major changes to Sokka's role in the Kyoshi Island episode. It's sort of comical. To avoid having Sokka come across as sexist, they somehow made an even more stereotypical and sexist version of Suki's character. Now that Sokka isn't coming from his macho masculine warrior hill, his and Suki's relationship feels off. At first, she's annoyed he'd dare compare their warrior upbringings, viewing him as an inferior since he isn't a Kyoshi warrior, falling directly into Sokka's role of seeing her as inferior since she was a female warrior. And making matters even worse, the very next scene throws that all away when she immediately grows interested in him after walking in on him in the bath, leading her to awkwardly flirt with him that he sees as her just trying to humiliate him. And then they flip back to their original idea, as Sokka seems to want to learn from the Kyoshi warriors since he now feels inferior, Suki taking pity on him and agreeing to help. It all just comes off as the writers thinking up two different paths they could have followed, but rather than developing one, they just mashed two concepts together, making a new Sokka-Suki relationship that, at best, makes her an awkward teen experiencing love for the first time, and at worst, makes her an arrogant warrior that throws it all away because she thought Sokka was attractive. Most of my like for this character came from my preconceived knowledge of her from the original show. Hopefully, they'll better figure her out when she returns in later seasons, but the writers did a massive disservice to both the character and actress with this fragmented and disjointed storyline. But no character is portrayed worse than Boomy. The Netflix series has some rough moments, but episode 4 is an absolute clusterfuck of an episode, and easily the worst hour of television I've sat through in a long time. And a large portion of that comes from this interpretation of Boomy. The interactions between him and Aang have zero sense to them, and not in the fun, whimsical way of OG Boomy or Empire Yoda. When Aang and Boomy go head-to-head in the animated show, everything eventually ties back together, each test looping back to the lesson Boomy was delivering, that Aang needed to think differently, like a mad genius, if he wished to best the Fire Nation and defeat the Fire Lord. Yet, Netflix Boomy is no more than a resentful old man, delivering the same message as every other avatar, that Aang needs to adapt into a merciless fighter that pushes away his friends and sacrifices those that don't help him reach his goal of defeating Ozai. This time, it's the timely arrival of Sokka and Katara that changes Boomy's mind, this interpretation turning Boomy from the mad genius helping his longtime friend and making him a resentful fool intended only to sow more doubt into Aang's mind. Boomy was the one character that my prior love for him from the OG could not convince me to like. I do hope later interactions can fix the damage that's been done, but it's clear there was no one on this team that understood the importance of Boomy's role in the original series. The events from the first book face some dramatic changes, something that heavily weighs on episodes 3, 4, and 5. With Aang no longer leading the gang on endless detours, a lot of the allies met through various side stories had to be repurposed to better fit the new narrative. Omashu, for example, becomes the site of a massive Fire Nation bombing plot, with a number of storylines being united for a more compact recounting of the Avatar storylines. Certain elements lost their impact. Team Avatar never really has a full confrontation with Jet's freedom fighters, Katara and Sokka simply stopping their plot, leading Jet to later confront Katara. The problem now is that there's no stakes. Katara was always more powerful than Jet, the danger being about whether she and the team could overcome his people and stop the flooding of the Fire Nation village all at once. Katara bests Jet so easily, it just makes you wonder why he came to confront her in the first place, just sort of making him look like an idiot. The final episode also gets hit with a lot of ripples from some of these earlier choices. Since Aang's already dealt with Ko in episode 5 and 6, the pair never encounter each other when Aang's in the Northern Water Tribe, So now, instead of Katara facing Zuko alone to try and protect Aang while he's still in the spirit world, she chooses to face him alone so Aang can go after Zhao. However, considering how evenly matched Aang and Zuko have been to this point, had him and Katara worked together, they would have easily bested him. And onto the topic of Zhao, he gives way more heads up on his plan to kill the moon spirit, which just makes Aang, Iroh, and Sokka all look incompetent when he eventually kills it, as they all stand around do nothing until it's already too late. The series does a lot to try and improve flow, but since they're still bound to the Avatar storyline and their wish to adapt specific moments, their characters are stuck in a loop of stupidity to make these moments possible. At least had Aang and Sokka confronted and lost to Zhao, this moment could have been saved, but as things play out, Zhao's victory comes from the incompetence of everyone else around him. And then there's Azula. And I was split on the Azula stuff. On one end, I liked how the show turned the Zhao and Zuko conflict into a massive game of chess being played by Ozai and her, further proving their ruthless detachment from their people. But adding in a storyline all about Azula's need to prove herself to Ozai and earn her status as the character we met in the original was not only completely unnecessary, but added nothing of value to any character in the show. I was actually drawn in by this false sense of change. This idea that Ozai may actually wish for Zuko's return and redemption. It was clear back in the animated show that both Ozai and Azula were heavily manipulating Zuko to their needs when he returned home through Book 3. But where Azula seemed to have some sort of genuine interest in collecting him into her posse, I always felt like Ozai was simply appeasing his son after he accomplished the impossible. Having a more complex relationship to Zuko and Ozai, where Ozai actually wanted Zuko to accomplish his task and return home, could have added a deeper impact when Zuko left to aid Aang, as his decision wouldn't just be because he realized his father was using him, but because despite having a real relationship with him, he understood what his father was doing was wrong, and needed to be stopped. Alas, this all amounted to nothing. Zuko himself just another pawn in Ozai's game against his daughter, spending an entire subplot just to put these characters into the exact same spot they were in when introduced in the second season. If it does change anything, it's that showing this bratty child upset daddy won't recognize her effectively destroys the danger Azula represented. Zuko was always the disgraced prince. Versus the perfect daughter and clear superior to the Fire Prince, Azula felt like a real danger when she first came onto the scene to challenge Aang and the gang. This version feeling more akin to the disheveled and crazy Azula we got during the 4-part finale. This version just shows us too much, and that's their grandest crime, the complete misunderstanding of the show don't tell rule, preferring to show us every event as they play out over showing us the real emotional connection experienced by the characters. Was it cool to watch the Air Nomads take on the invading Firebenders? Absolutely. Also, sort of made me wonder how they all lost, as even with the Comet on their side, the Fire Nation needed like 10 Benders just to take down one Air Nomad. But worst of all, so much emphasis is put into the actual attack that when Aang finally reaches the Southern Air Temple in present day, the emotion isn't there. The scene's rushed and the shock's gone, making this moment more akin to a pit stop on Aang's journey rather than the important moment it is for his character, especially when you consider all the guilt he talks about having through the next 7 episodes. It also doesn't help that the big oh shit moment, the reappearance of Sozin's comet, doesn't come into play at all. Roku's too busy warning Aang against facing Ko that the scene is repurposed as a post-credits tease between Ozai and the Master Sage. This original warning that puts a timetable on Aang's journey and adds real pressure to the rest of the series now gone, traded in for a meaningless nod to the camera moment. I've harped on this show a lot, but it's not all bad. Much like One Piece, they've set out to find ways to tell a more compact and focused story, all while ensuring major players into Aang and the gang's journey remain on their path. The Amashu bombing subplot working to introduce Jet to Katara, set up Sokka to work with the Mechanist, and give Aang a chance to inspire freedom for a young freedom fighter via Teo. And I personally really like the way most of Episode 3 plays out. All these elements tied together in a way that creates an interesting bit of tension between our heroes, and gives them real issues to work through, all while still having to save the city. And I want to give a huge shout out to the way this version adapts Iroh's backstory, and not just how Liu Ten's death affected him and forged a stronger bond between him and Zuko, but how his time as the Dragon of the West affected his previous victims. And there's just a good deal of connection shown throughout. Iroh's show of compassion to his enemy leaving him open to attack, a mishap that comes back and triggers Zuko when Aang dares to speak to him about how the Fire Nation needs to show compassion. Additionally, utilizing the Cave of Two Lovers in this version to mend the relationship between brother and sister was a creative alternative to the cave's original use, a decision that greatly benefits their relationship going forward. And having them get trapped in the spirit world during Aang's conflict with Ko felt far more dangerous than their original sickness, and need to suck on frogs. Even if this did bring about the wrong version of show don't tell, it was clear that Katara's mother had died to protect her, claiming herself as the last waterbender in the South Pole, but a part of her death was meant to show the senseless violence brought about by the Fire Nation. Having her death be a direct result of Katara's actions, and more so that her pretending to attack was what got her killed, changes a key moment from this scene. Despite still showing the Fire Nation as the clear aggressors, her action now paints doubt, leading us to wonder if the soldier attacked in response and not just because of his cruelty. Thanks to how this moment is now framed, it leaves doubt as to whether or not Katara's mother could have survived. But back to giving credit where it's due, I do believe the best change comes from the way they built up Ozai. While the Fire Nation scenes did a disservice to Azula, it did a phenomenal job of painting Ozai into a menacing and manipulative tyrant. Ozai's willingness to sacrifice his troops was a small footnote in the original story, meant simply to send Zuko into exile, but it serves as a major part of his character this time around. Ozai believing that the weak should willingly risk and spend their lives in service of the Fire Nation, even openly admitting that Zhao is no one of consequence when he and Azula first rope him into their chess game. He's cruel, unsympathetic, and rotten to the core. And Netflix's take does an amazing job of not only showing this, but sculpting it in a way that still makes him look like a man of his people. Most of the Fire Nation willingly follow his lead, and those that don't aren't around long enough to sow any real discourse. And thanks to him, the show's best oh shit moment comes right at the finale. In the animated show, the war in the North was seen as one of Aang's first major victories. Yes, they still suffered losses, and the Northern Water Tribe was left to deal with the damages, but this battle proved that the Fire Nation could be repelled and ultimately bested. But now, Ozai reveals that their invasion in the north was merely a decoy, a way to turn eyes there while their real plan was put into motion, the capture of Omashu. This time, everything's gone in accordance to the Fire Lord's plan, stripping the gang of their victory and making him feel far more dangerous. There are a number of things that hold back a creator when bringing a project to life, and lack of passion sits at the very top. And Netflix's Avatar was a show that left me scratching my head. On one hand, they have beautiful set pieces, beloved moments are recreated, and minor characters that would be ignored in most other adaptations still find time, and the overall aesthetic is just kept intact. But for every great piece of action and well-handled effect, there's a shot or action that looks unfinished. Some costumes look like bad cosplays, and there's just a lack of speed to a lot of the battles comprised of pure bending. Worst of all, there's a terrible misunderstanding as to what Avatar: The Last Airbender is. At its core, The Last Airbender is a kid's show, one with powerful enough messages to keep hold of its maturing audiences, but a kid's show all the same. It was never intended for an adult audience, making the ultimate failure their attempt to make it into a mature and dark tale. Nobody wanted to watch a depressed Aang battle through a brutal and unforgiving world. The magic of Avatar is that as a kid, you don't realize how disturbed this world is, all thanks to Aang and his endless reserve of carefree energy and childish outlook. Aang was always meant to represent youthful freedom and hope. There's a reason the kids are always the ones saving the day, where the adults regularly fail. Where the more powerful older characters, people like Iroh and Bumi, still held the heart of a child. Like all shows intended for young audiences, it wants kids to embrace their imagination, freedom, and pure ability to be a kid. Strip that away, and you've no longer got Avatar: The Last Airbender. But this is what makes Netflix's attempt at The Last Airbender such a unique take, because it's not a good adaptation, completely missing the core elements that made Avatar what it was nearly 20 years ago. But the concept alone works. What makes Avatar special is that it is a concept that could easily be made for a much more mature audience, and the new show proves this. If we were to completely forget everything we know about the 2005 animated show, this wouldn't be a terrible take. Aang's continued depression and paranoia makes sense. It's just not what longtime fans wanted to see. Now that isn't to say that every issue can be chalked up to stubborn fans. As we mentioned through this video, there are a number of inconsistencies and poor story choices made, some in the heart of trying to adapt a key moment from the original. But we do get small changes with worthwhile impact, small alterations to the deeper details, like Zuko being crewed with the division he saved, a choice that has me hoping his crew will find a way to return and play a bigger role when things come to a head between Zuko and his family. Netflix's Avatar is a terrible adaptation of the original animated show, but it's not a bad show in and of itself. There's promise there, and if they iron out the kinks and find a way to better capitalize on the changes they make, rather than shying away at the last second, I believe they can save their later seasons.